Welcome to Curious and Quirky, the podcast that unpacks innovation, pokes at conventional wisdom, and occasionally asks questions that sound ridiculous right up until they turn out to be brilliant. This isn't your grandpa's podcast. Though if he was anything like most dads today, he'd probably spent years fixing things that weren't actually broken, refusing to ask for directions, and somehow teach you important things along the way. Now, each month we bring together the bold, the brilliant, and slightly rebellious minds from Caltech's Executive Education to explore what leaders and teams mostly get right and what we can learn when they don't. And since it's June, we're going to lean into Father's Day a bit today because dads have a funny way of approaching the world. They're endlessly curious. They believe every problem can be solved with enough determination and at least one trip to the garage. And they're never afraid to ask the really important questions, which, when you think about it, isn't all that different from innovation. So grab your coffee or it'll only take 5 minutes French roast or whatever fuels your next big idea, and let's get curious and maybe a little bit quirky. All right, so if Father's Day has taught us really anything, it's that every big adventure starts with someone asking, do we have everything we need before we leave? And usually someone saying no. And that's where Alan Dunn comes in. Alan is a supply chain strategist, an innovation leader, and one of those rare people who can look at a complex global system and see the connections that most of us completely miss. Now, most of us think about space exploration is simply about rockets and astronauts and billion-dollar technology. But Alan looks at the same mission and asks a very different question. Who remembered to pack the spare parts? Today, Alan's going to take us behind the scenes of humanity's next giant leap, of exploring the invisible systems that will determine whether our future beyond Earth is sustainable, scalable, and ultimately achievable. Because, getting to the moon is exciting, but staying there becomes a logistics problem. And as every dad knows, the real challenge isn't actually getting somewhere, it's realizing halfway through the trip that you forgot something important. Ladies and gentlemen, Alan Dunn.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Really appreciate that. A couple weeks ago, I was at an annual conference speaking, actually sitting on a panel with some just brilliant entrepreneurs and innovators at the Space Tech Conference. And this conference is done every year, and it's also got an exhibit hall. And before my presentation, I went through the exhibit hall, about 1,000, maybe 800 to 1,000 exhibitors. And it dawned on me, I wasn't actually in a space technology conference. I was in a supply chain conference and I added them up, and fully 97+% of all the exhibitors were companies that made things or moved things or stored things. And a lot of them were focused on the spacecraft and the future lunar economy and perhaps even the Mars economy. So it just dawned on me again how everything oftentimes comes back to supply chains. So today I want to talk about what I call from Earth to the moon, kind of rethinking supply chains for a sustainable lunar presence, which of course is the precursor to a Mars presence. So we are returning to the moon, and this time it's to stay. The current U.S. administration has reaffirmed its commitment to maintaining American leadership in space by pledging to return and stay on the moon. And they have what they call the Artemis campaign. In early April, Artemis 2 and its 4 astronauts flew around the moon and safely returned to Earth. It was the first crewed test flight to the moon since the Apollo program of the early 1970s, and even before that, the 1960s. As part of the upcoming Artemis 3 launch, humans are going to explore the lunar South Pole region for the first time. We've never been there. The Artemis campaign also includes the establishment of a sub-program referred to as Gateway, which is humanity's first space station, this time around the moon, not around the Earth. In addition to these ambitious goals, NASA wants to establish a lunar village by 2035, so less than 10 years away. Now, when we think about supply chains here on Earth, we tend to think in terms of efficiency. We optimize for cost, we optimize for speed, and we optimize for scale. We design systems that are lean, interconnected, and increasingly just in time, although since the pandemic, a little bit of just in case inventory as well. But on the moon, None of this is going to apply. A lunar supply chain is not about efficiency. It's primarily about survival. On Earth, if supply chains fail, you actually have alternatives. You reroute, you expedite parts, you adapt. On the moon. There's no backup supplier. There's no local substitute. And there's certainly no overnight shipping. FedEx does not go to the moon and does not have any plans to go to the moon. Resupply cycles are measured in months, not days or hours, and every launch remains extraordinarily expensive and limited in cadence. Even today, as we return to the moon through this new program, the Artemis program, the logistics model actually reflects this reality. It assumes a lot of launches, repeated cargo deliveries, and super carefully choreographed buildup of infrastructure over time. Think about the infrastructure that's necessary to go to the moon is enormously more complex than the infrastructure of fueling stations on Earth to allow cars to exist. So NASA isn't just planning missions, it's actually constructing a deep space logistics system and is doing it from scratch. And that leads to a fundamental truth. This has dawned on me as I was at that conference and talking to everybody from astronauts to rocket builders to solar energy developers. Every component on the moon has to be treated as a single point of failure, or better yet, engineered so it isn't. At the heart of every lunar supply chain decision will be the simple question, what can you afford to launch? Mass is the ultimate bottleneck. Every kilo sent to the moon comes with a significant cost, and every launch has strict payload limits. This forces extreme prioritization. This is what we live with. We live with prioritization. That is the key to supply chain management. It's about prioritizing every day. Do you, but on the lunar surface, this is on steroids. Do you carry redundant inventory or do you maximize capability? Do you optimize for safety or do you optimize for functionality? Even with modern heavy lift systems, those being developed by SpaceX and others, delivering tens of metric tons per mission is still not enough to rapidly build into a supply base of scale. The implication here, in my view, is unavoidable. You cannot ship your way to a sustainable lunar presence. Instead, we have to flip the supply chain model, the lunar supply chain model as it's currently looked at, and we have to learn how to manufacture, produce, and source materials locally. That means on the moon itself. This is where in situ resource utilization, or what NASA refers to as ISRU, becomes essential, not optional. It is essential. If we're going to stay on the moon and not just visit it temporarily, the moon itself has to become part of the supply chain. Water ice becomes both life support and it becomes metaphorically the rocket fuel for sustainability. The regolith, or the soil and the dirt and the infrastructure of the moon, becomes construction material, and oxygen becomes breathable air and as well as engine propellant. So the focus is already shifting on these capabilities. We see a lot of organizations. In fact, I probably saw at least 100 companies at the conference that were investing in water extraction, autonomous construction, and advanced manufacturing systems that can actually operate in extreme environments. And I saw technologies like 3D printing developed for developing actually rocket motor parts that had to be replaced on the moon to get home. Robotic and autonomous construction devices, on-site manufacturing systems. These are not science fiction any longer. They were actually at the conference. This is not fiction. They are actually part of the lunar supply chain requirement. And this is because ultimately the first truly sustainable lunar supply chain is the one that reduces and eventually eliminates dependence on Earth. I want you to think about that. Supply chain independence on the moon means lack of dependence on Earth. We've never had that kind of a problem in the history of the world. There's another dimension, however, that often is underestimated, and that is power. Equal to my interest in what's happening off of this Earth, that is in both lunar and the Mars opportunities, is the on-Earth development of power. I've spent a lot of time the last several years thinking about how power and energy is developed and distributed. It's a whole lot different, though, in the lunar environment. Every node in a supply chain on Earth depends on energy, transport, processing, manufacturing, storage, communication. On the moon, it won't be any different, except that power is not guaranteed. And part of the problem is the nature of the moon. There's 14-day cycles of light and dark, extreme temperature swings, and obviously no existing grid. So this led to an interesting ongoing debate, and several of the programs at the conference and the education tracks discussed this. Effectively, it was do we rely on solar infrastructure on the moon to power these logistics and supply chains programs, or do we invest in nuclear surface power and perhaps microreactors? So from a supply chain perspective, this actually isn't even an engineering decision. It's an engineering dilemma, but it's not an engineering decision. It is actually foundational to a lunar economy. So power determines what can be produced locally, how autonomous operations can run on the moon, and then, of course, whether logistics hubs can even exist on the moon. In other words, distribution centers for parts. Put simply, on the moon, power, it turns out, is upstream of the entire supply chain. No power means no logistics. You can start to see how complex this is now. But it's also important to recognize that the logistics architecture that we actually need on the moon for the Artemis program to create an economy or to create a village on the moon doesn't actually exist yet. Today, we're heavily reliant on a small set of commercial providers for transport launch, launch vehicles, lunar landers, cargo delivery systems, etc. Many of these are still in development. A lot of them are experiencing delays. And like in-space refueling, it's still not operational. There's a shift, however, happening. However, this still results in this kind of supply chain to the moon and back being very fragile, very much still evolving, and heavily influenced by politics and program decisions. It's not yet standardized, and that's what standardization is necessary for scalability. So this brings me to a point that's often overlooked. Supply chain resilience in space is not just technical, it's actually geopolitical. In the early stages of the lunar economy, it still looks like it's government driven and going to be government driven, even though we'll have independent suppliers. It still depends on stable funding, international partnerships, and regulatory clarity. And that introduces some real risks into the model. So from a supply chain perspective, we have to expand how we think about inputs. Infrastructure matters, technology matters, but so does policy. In the early lunar economy, policy now is actually part of the supply chain. Now, there's a lot of excitement about a future lunar economy, but from a supply chain perspective, we need to be clear about what comes first. So transportation comes first. We have to get there and be able to get back. Power infrastructure comes second. It has to be reliable and continuous. Communication comes third. We have to be able to link assets with the systems and on Earth as well as the Earth itself. We have to have life support and habitation. We have to have logistics and storage until those layers are stable. In other words, not just developed, but stable. Everything else is premature. So there's a lot of short-term and long-term visions. In the short term, I think this is still government-led and will be. If we're going to do this, we're going to have to build high-cost infrastructure with limited financial returns, at least for the short term. Commercial viability is still not yet the driver. Capability is. And it turns out that the commercial side actually has the capability now. But over the long term, the opportunity, in my view, becomes a whole lot clearer. It's going to move to an infrastructure as a service for power, transport, and communications. In other words, government will enlist the companies like SpaceX and others, and it will be infrastructure as a service. And that service will be power, transport, and communications. Transport's already there. Power doesn't exist. Communications will likely morph into that, into a service sort of a part of the economy. We also have to build this resource extraction and processing capability. And even then, the goal really won't be immediate profits. The goal is much more fundamental than all of that. It's how do we not lower the cost of getting to the moon? This is key now. It's about lowering the cost of staying on the moon. If Apollo was about getting to the moon, Artemis is about staying there. And staying turns exploration into a supply chain problem. Until we solve for resilience, local lunar production, and reliable energy supply on the moon, a sustainable human presence, and a true lunar economy will actually remain aspirational. This is because on the moon, logistics isn't just a support function. It's it's actually the mission, and that is a supply chain mission. And with that, I would like to turn this over, and I apologize. I don't remember who the next speaker is, but I'm sure it's a spectacular program. So thank you.
Alan, it's me, Mary. And I just want to say that you have always surprised me. I mean, before about 10 minutes ago, I had never even thought about lunar villages. So my eyes are open, and thank you for helping me think of something I had not even thought of before. So I'm going to tell you something that I have been thinking a lot about lately because it's kind of the buzz. People planning to attend the World Cup at MetLife Stadium here. I'm in the Northeast. They're facing an interesting choice. A round trip ticket from Penn Station to the stadium is $98. Now, under normal circumstances, that same ticket is only $13. So, as expected, people are saying, why such a dramatic increase? And how is a 35-minute train ride worth nearly $100? And then they, of course, have to start comparing alternatives, buses, ride shares, driving, and you can't even really do parking because that is very limited. So the pricing logistics from the New Jersey transport, it appears straightforward, but it's very inside out. The World Cup created significant transportation, staffing, security, operational costs. And they estimated that's going to be like tens of millions of dollars. So they sought to recover these costs with a special event fare. So as a result, they were going to charge $150 per ticket. And then, of course, people reacted. And so they reduced it to 105 and then down to 98 because I guess that's a better price point. But they were able to bring in sponsorships and grants and other sources of funding that kind of offset that. But consumers are still saying that it seems expensive. So, however, what if the New Jersey Transit had taken an outside-in approach and positioned the train ride very differently? Instead of it being just basic transportation, it was seen as part of the World Cup experience with World Cup branding and the team themes and entertainment, merch, of course, right? And of course, that's security. Everything to make it feel more unique and more valuable. So, and think about it, the MetLife soccer fans are already paying, $500 to $4,000 and then even a lot more. So they're paying that for the tickets. So by taking a more holistic approach, they may have been able to shift that conversation from why is that train fare so high to that looks like a pretty fun part of that total experience. And they would have had a very different value perception and maybe, willing to pay more. So as you look across industries, pricing typically is based on three things. Of course, cost, that's what we're looking at here, where you recover your expenses. The second is the competition. So where you evaluate the alternatives that people have to consider. And then the third is the customer value. We kind of call it the three C's: cost, competition, and then customer value. And that's uncovering what they're willing to pay for. So while these three approaches all seem logical, the order that you take them in is huge. It is what makes the difference. So if New Jersey Transit had started with number one, how can we create customer value or enhance that experience of the World Cup? Number two, how does it compare with the other alternatives, transportation alternatives that they have? And then number three, does hopefully the price cover the cost? And, if not, they need to offset it like they were doing. So going back to that, pricing based on customer value, a lot of companies shy away from it because they say it's just too hard to measure customer value. So there's always a really good example of a company that, tries to kind of shortcut it and they try to exceed customer perceived value. So one of my favorite poster children is, of course, Doritos. Doritos, over the past several years, customers have watched the price of Doritos, a small bag of Doritos, go up to $7. Okay, so for a short period of time, of course, customers paid, and then they started to shift over to either private label or just other types of snack items. Retailers shifted the shelf space, of course, and so PepsiCo started to see their sales fall and market share decline, and they lost a lot of money. So it appears that PepsiCo hadn't used the real world data to see that even with a very powerful brand, they had exceeded customers' perception of what value there is. So they're adjusting that. So there are much better ways to measure value before they show up on your sales or your market share. Forward-looking companies often use what we call price sensitivity research. And it's where we can, ask people, and we adjust for what their overstatements, but we ask them, at what price would it be this, expensive, but you still consider buying it? And then at what price is it just too expensive? So you can do research to do that. There's also price value analysis. Bradley Gale had originally introduced this, and it's a great model. We use it all the time to see what the customer's trade-off is of value versus price. And through this, we can see, is it a reasonable price strategy, or do we need to somehow change our price strategy? So some of the organizations that we work with have discovered that they are creating more value than they're capturing. So that's always a good thing. Oh, we can actually capture more. And then there are some that the customers perceive less differentiation and less value. And often it's the management that still believes, oh no, there's still value, and they overprice in the market, like what we saw with Doritos. So B2B type companies, purchasing decisions are often viewed as fundamentally different because they involve a procurement process, business cases, contracts, ROI calculations. Yet really it's the same basic dynamics here. Technology companies often add features and functionality and cost, and they assume that their clients automatically perceive more value and be willing to pay more. That obviously isn't true. So software providers increase subscription fees because renewal rates have historically been strong, and so they overlook that, and the customers actually have different options that they can when they have their renewal cycles. So they miss that the market is dynamic and customer perceptions, they shift. So given that you and your company are likely facing some interesting pricing challenges in this crazy environment, it may be helpful for you to frame your next pricing discussions in this order. Number one, what's the customer value? What are their perceptions of our products and services? And even what's their perception of that experience that they have with us? Number two is the competition, of course. Who and what are the customers that, the customers are considering different alternatives, and what are those alternatives? Sometimes they're direct competitors, sometimes they're indirect competitors. And then cost, what cost are you assigning to those products and services? And based on the price you consider, can you cover those costs, or do you need to adjust in some way? So we teach pricing at Caltech, and if obviously I'm passionate about it. So if you ever want to talk pricing, there's too many examples of good and bad pricing here. So anyway, I want to now hand you over to someone that's always creating value and making us think new and in different ways. It's Bryan Mattimore. Bryan?
All right, thank you, Mary. Well, as the listeners to our podcast know, we're always try to take timely topics, whether we're going to the World Cup or the moon. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually look to the past, which was the inspiration for ultimately for the timely topic I want to share. So just go with me on this. One of the wonderful things to look at in the past is the journals or the notebooks of great thinkers. And I've done a lot of that research really for the past 30 years. And to me, it's entertaining. I think it's a lot of fun. So I'll just share a few of those, and then I'll make the link to what I'm suggesting that these inspired. And Da Vinci, our probably greatest notebooker of all time, right? He had a question. He said, I need to, it was a wish, really. I want to describe the tongue of a woodpecker which is to me a really interesting question because if you're banging your head against wood all the time, what does it do to the tongue? Or the anatomy of the jaw of a crocodile, right? For Ben Franklin, who is interested in personal growth and being a good person, in his morning journal, he'd say, "What good shall I do today?" But then he made the link to his nighttime journal, "What good have I done today?" Um, Buckminster Fuller, of course, he was studying structures in nature, and he was always, and this ties into what Alan said in some ways, find out ways to do more with less, right? Richard Feynman, the great Caltech Nobel Prize winner, he was at the cafeteria one day and he was fascinated by the question, why do spinning plates wobble, right? And by the way, if you haven't read his book, The Pleasure of Finding Things Out, we're on the Curious and Quirky podcast, assuming you're curious about the world. If you haven't read that book, it is just such a joy to read because it has so many stories about his life, including working on Los Alamos on the development of the atomic bomb. Charles Darwin, in his notebook, of course, focused on nature, he asked a really interesting question. Why do earthworms matter? Right? And then the last one I'll share, because I've done more research on Edison than any of them. And I talked about this one in my book, 21 Days to a Big Idea. Edison, in his January 3rd, 1888 notebook, he titled it Things Doing and Things to Be Done. All right, so we're talking about to-do list, but his to-do wasn't take out the garbage. Here, he had a 5-page list of over 100 items, and here are just a few of them. Of working on develop a phonographic clock, or artificial mother of pearl, or silver wire wood cutting system, or ink for the blind, right? Or chalk batteries, okay? And then one of my favorites, the notion of a snow compressor, okay? So what does this all have to do with today? I think that in these times, in addition to our to-do list, take out the garbage, register the car, etc., that the timing is pretty good now for creating also what I would call a wonder list. And this would challenge us to say, well, I wonder about fill in the blank. And I've been, when I got this idea, I think I read an article on Da Vinci or whatever. I've been experimenting with this for myself for the last couple weeks, doing an I wonder list. And what if the listeners want to try this for themselves, I think what you'll discover is what you're interested in, how you're interested in things. Because I was less interested in, the mechanism of how a crocodile's mouth works, right? And more interested about things around the psychology of the future, the psychology of women and men and children, etc., in the future. And so, one of the questions I asked myself, actually, let me hold off on that before I share that. So, what you're going to find is that I think the questions you're asking, the things that you're wondering about could be, why does this exist and what could exist? And I'm interested in the future. And so for me, it's kind of what could exist, right? And also you'll find interesting questions, maybe in your business life, certainly in your personal life. I'll just share a couple of examples from our work. You can be interested in what are the problems. It's an obvious idea, but what are the problems that our customers are facing? When we were working on Craftsman tools, ratchets, wrenches, and sockets, oh my, by studying in great depth how their consumers are using these products, we discovered there was a tremendous problem actually seeing the size of the ratchet of the sockets when you're underneath the car and don't necessarily have light. And so that led to the ideas of laser etched sockets, which allows you to see a much bigger size of the socket, right? The other one I'll share, which was fun, from the research we discovered. And by the way, if you're looking for interesting things to think about your brand and how consumers might be using your brand in creative ways, the social listening tools are really great. The sanitary napkins, most sailors know it's a great trick for using sanitary napkins to suck up oil leaks on their boats, right? Um, so, uh, and this is an odd example, you know, how were German sailors using condoms in World War, submariners using condoms? Yeah, okay. Well, they were using them actually as weather balloons. Okay. And so they would, they fill the boat with condoms. All right. So we'll move on. So, the question I asked myself, I found myself, and again, this will indicate what you're interested in. I found myself asking interesting psychological problems. So one of the fantasy questions I asked was, what would happen if, fill in the blank, we woke up with a different face every day? Right? Now, this could be the subject of science fiction, but the ramifications as you begin to think about that for politics, for science, for religion, for crime prevention, et cetera, are really fascinating. You say, well, are you on drugs here? What are you talking about? Well, it's an interesting way to expand your view of the world. And I've always found that as I expand my own thinking, there are linkages to things that happen. And these seemingly absurd excursions can be really valuable. Another what if question, or what would happen if question, I asked the question, what would happen if our words actually became visualized as they came out of their mouth, like clouds or whatever, and then they disappeared after 5 minutes? What would the effect be on the people listening to us and actually how we talk? Because I think there'd be less swearing in the world. That's people, uh, but I also think it would help us be more precise about our own language. These are obviously weird examples, but the net here for the curious and quirky listener, um, I would encourage you to just try as an experiment the idea of creating not only to-do lists, but I wonder lists. And I think you can have fun with it. You can actually ask your kids to help you with this because they're wondering all the time, wonderful questions. Why is the sky is blue, etc. So in that vein, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Boyd, who I know wonders all the times with his younger daughter. And so in honor of Father's Day, and I've never met Tim's daughter, but obviously I've met Tim and know Tim, and I can tell he's just a wonderful father because not only is he ensuring that his daughter keeps open to wonderful possibilities, but I know he also uses it to challenge his own thinking and come up with new ideas. So, with that, I'll turn it over to Tim in honor of a great Father's Day. Tim, you're up.
All right, thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that. And I do love what you mentioned about, you mentioned something, what could exist. And I think that ties in really well with my topic this month, where I'm going to focus on the fact that everyone loves an underdog until it's time to pick a winner. And I know that everyone has World Cup fever, so you're going to have to I'm going to have to apologize in advance, but I'm going to talk about this year's French Open, not necessarily the World Cup. They're just getting through stage one. It's, a lot of stuff happening. But one of the biggest stories coming out of this year's French Open was I will say, the incredible Cinderella run of Maya Chalinsky. Now, everybody loves a Cinderella story, and I think I'm one of those as well. But here's what I've always found fascinating about those types of journeys is if I had asked anyone, even you, before the tournament to pick the winner, how many of you who know about tennis would have actually chosen her? Okay? Probably not many people. She probably had very long odds to win that. And that's actually pretty strange because underdog stories, happen way more often than you would believe. We celebrate them constantly every year in sports and business and science and in life. Everyone is looking for that story to share it for inspiration and motivation, etc. Yet somehow we're still surprised every single time it happens. There was a poet named Shane Koizon, and he was extremely impactful on my life when he gave his initial TEDx talk, and he basically did a recited poem, which was really powerful. But he once said that we love the underdogs because we see ourselves in them. And I think he hit that spot on, and that's always stayed with me because most of us know what it feels like to be overlooked. And most of us know what it feels like to be, I'll say, underestimated. To wonder whether we're actually capable of doing something bigger and better than we're actually doing right now. And so I think that's why we overall cheer for the underdogs, because their story feels a lot like our own. But the more I was thinking about Shane's quote recently, the more I actually realized something that when we watch the story of an underdog or when we watch the underdogs win, we're only seeing the final chapter, the very tail end book. We see them winning the trophy, but we don't see all the hard work and the dedication that led up to that singular moment of success. They had consistent losses, they have never-ending sacrifices, maybe the moments that they wanted to quit, and how about all those mornings that, they showed up when no one else was watching. I'm an LA person, so let's think about Kobe Bryant. People remember the championships, they remember the MVP trophies, they remember the highlights, they remember Mamba mentality. But what they don't remember are the thousands of hours he spent in empty gyms before anyone else showed up. There's a famous story out there. Another point guard in the NBA, Jay Williams, he arrived early to the gym. He wanted to get some extra reps, practice reps in before a game, before they played the Lakers. But when he walked actually out onto the court, he saw Kobe was already there and completely drenched in sweat and looking like he'd been practicing for at least an hour. And Williams stood on the sidelines and just watched Kobe constantly, relentlessly drill his moves for another 30, 45 minutes without stopping. And eventually, Jay did his workout. He eventually left, and Kobe was still on the court. And that night, Kobe went out in the game and put on a master class and really scored 40 points against Williams' team. Now, after the game, Williams actually approached Kobe and said, "Hey, why were you in the gym for so long and pushing yourself so hard?" And Kobe simply looked at him and delivered his famous response, "Because I saw you come in, I wanted you to know that it doesn't matter how hard you work, I'm willing to work harder than you." So when you think about shifting gears to swimming, let's think about Michael Phelps. Obviously people remember the medals, people remember the domination in the Olympics. They remember him winning a gold medal with water in his goggles. I mean, some iconic moments for that person. But they don't remember the holidays he spent training while everyone else was celebrating, or the amount of things he had to miss due to always being in the pool. The victories are rarely sudden, right? They don't happen just overnight. The visibility, though, tends to happen that way. And maybe that's why we're always just surprised, because maybe we don't know those people or we haven't heard of them before, etc. But not because the greatness appeared overnight. It's because we weren't paying attention while it was being built. In fact, I think I'd like you to think about something you're good at today. Each one of you on the call has something that you're really good at. You think today, maybe it's leadership or parenting or public speaking. Maybe it's your profession. Now, I want you to think back. Have you ever had one of those moments where suddenly everything just clicked and you just realized that you knew what you were doing and you felt really, really good with it? Um, you know, I think that the moment that I'm looking for is where you finally and ultimately realized, I'm actually pretty good at this. It's not something that I have to really work for or work really, really hard at anymore. From the outside, that success that you achieved in that moment or felt in that moment probably looked natural and or sudden, right? But on the inside, you know what it felt like. You felt like it took years, years of mistakes, years of practice, years of learning. And I know exactly what that feels like. A long time ago, years ago, I was giving a talk at a technical conference, and the presentation went really well. I knew the material, I knew the slides, I knew the messaging. Then the Q&A started, and someone asked a question, and I froze. Not because I didn't know the question, and not because I wasn't qualified to answer the question, but I froze because I think I wasn't comfortable enough trusting myself when the script disappeared. Thankfully, someone else stepped in and answered the question, but it taught me a valuable lesson that you have to be adaptable, and adaptability usually is what saves the day. But I remember walking away from that conference and recognizing, man, I've got a lot to learn. It's not just getting up there and being confident. You have to know a whole lot more and be able to adapt. And if you told me that one day, that at least that day, that I'd be teaching leadership classes and giving keynote talks and hosting a podcast and standing in front of hundreds of people, I probably wouldn't have believed you. Not because I didn't think that I couldn't do it, but because I couldn't see it yet. And today, before almost every talk that I give, I still remind myself of something specific. I tell myself that for the next hour, you're the expert. You were invited here for a reason. You were chosen for a reason. Go make an impact. And it doesn't matter if there's 5 people in the audience or 400 people in the audience. I give myself the exact same spiel every single time because that's what helps me. And I think maybe that's the lesson that I'm trying to articulate here is that preparation becomes, I'll say, a permission for you to go off and do these things. But at some point, you have to remember that the work you put in matters and you have to be able to trust that. And that's what I found so valuable, I think, from Shane Koizan's quote, is because if you really do love the underdogs, because we see ourselves in them, then maybe there's another question we need to start asking ourselves because, why do we often believe in them more than we believe in ourselves? It's an interesting perspective is we cheer for the dedication and the persistence and we admire their resilience and we celebrate their sudden growth or their sudden blowing up there. But when we personally experience setbacks, we often convince ourselves that we're not good enough. I gave a talk yesterday actually that included many of the leadership lessons that my daughter specifically has taught me. And one of the biggest lessons I think that she's taught me is that every failure doesn't deserve a lifetime membership in your mind. Kids are incredibly good at deciding what's worth carrying forward and what's worth leaving behind. And they don't let what happened to them define them for eternity. Adults aren't very good at that because we usually say, I'm a failure rather than I failed. And I find that we're willing to give strangers the benefit of the doubt, that we refuse to sometimes give to ourselves. And so I think that's why these underdog stories and stories of underdogs resonate so deeply with us because it's not because they remind us of us. They remind us of who they ultimately became. And we correlate that with who we believe we're still becoming in the long run, that we have an opportunity to continue to grow and shine. So I think that the next time you find yourself cheering for the underdog, I want you to remember this. You aren't cheering for perfection. You're cheering for the inevitable possibility of something great to happen. You're cheering for someone who kept pushing and going long enough for the world to finally see their value. And if Shane ultimately was right, if we really do see ourselves in the underdogs, maybe the hardest question we ask isn't whether we believe in them. Maybe it's whether we're willing to believe in ourselves. Because sometimes the future GOAT or greatest of all time just looks like today's underdog, including the one staring back at you in the mirror. All right, so with that, we're going to bring everyone back to the table, and we've got lots of questions. At least I know I do for sure. A comment for Mary on the costing. I think that the costing thing is interesting. I don't know if I've alluded to this before, but I remember I was in LAX, I travel out to LA all the time. But there's this one shop in LAX, I think it's the Wolfgang Puck restaurant or something like that, where for whatever reason, I think it was maybe last year, they decided to raise the price of a 20-ounce Diet Pepsi drink to now $8, which I find fascinating. That is definitely not worth $8. So, but everywhere else, you have the Hudson News and all the other different stores like that around, all the same price at $4. So I don't understand. I think this goes to your point of the Wolfgang Puck brand. They just didn't understand the customer value or whatever it may be that people maybe they're paying it. I just don't understand. But I thought that was an interesting example, like you showed, that someone's out of touch with reality.
Yeah, it is I mean, we would pay $16 for a Coke at a stadium,
Right,
because we don't have any alternatives. But
right.
it's pretty stark when you're at a place where, right next door it's $4. So I agree with you. It is amazing how sometimes, people price things and And they're trying to extract value in every way they can. And yeah, it just becomes obnoxious.
It does.
um, I do want to say happy Father's Day to the three of you. And Alan, you have a question that somebody submitted. Did you happen to see that in the chat?
No, I did not, but I will get it.
All right.
And by the way, I'm Bryan Mattimore today. I used your
Yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful thing to wonder about, Mary. Thank you.
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I wanted to come incognito. I wonder if anyone will notice I'm not Bryan Mattimore.
Yeah, so I'll jump in and answer that question about energy being the foundation of the lunar economy. The writer is absolutely correct. It is the foundation of everything. It's also the foundation of everything here on Earth, practically. And so we have to figure out new ways of providing energy. Think about this. With the 14-day night cycle, you would have to have batteries to be able to power an ability or a community for 14 days straight if you relied on solar. And so solar is not the ultimate solution. And probably nuclear is the solution. But the problem with nuclear power is that you have to actually build it there, because to ship nuclear material from here to the Earth, first off, you got a real launch safety issue. I don't think people in Florida want to have tons and tons of nuclear material flying over their heads as they launch it, although most of the Mars rovers are nuclear powered. But the reality is that it's the heaviest possible thing you can ship. And so there has to be, so this is a real dilemma. The new micro reactor technology has some level of promise to it, but still this becomes really problematic. One area that has not been explored yet on the moon, because we haven't had a chance to, is the geothermal. I actually spent quite a bit of time with a geothermal lunar exploration company there's a ton of venture funding going into these kinds of organizations. And of course, the reason for that is that mining on the moon looks like the most likely profitable business in the short term. Well, that and geothermal go hand in hand. We just don't know much about what's inside the moon underneath the crust. So there's a lot of huge challenges. Caltech and others are working on the idea of space-based solar panels that basically microwave beam the energy back down to Earth. May actually find some traction on the moon before it finds traction on Earth. But you're right. This is one of the biggest dilemmas. That's why I keep saying that, to me, and it shouldn't take us away from exploration of the moon and our aspirations. But really, a lunar economy is aspirational at this point in time. It's almost an impossible problem. But then going to the moon in 1969 was an impossible problem too, that we did. We pulled it off in basically 10 years. We pulled that off. And so that doesn't mean it's impossible. We just have to rethink it differently. Now that we're rethinking the whole lunar issue as a supply chain issue, rather than just a getting there, says that we've kind of mastered in some way the propulsion and how to get there. The problem is how to stay there is the challenge.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, right, Alan, is that I think in the 1960s, though, obviously there was a huge mass of dedication of resources, right? Where we're not seeing that today. We're seeing a dissemination of resources, and plus, there's lots more competition with, other competing, industry partners who are doing their own thing and slightly different, et cetera. So there's no, obviously, one cohesive vision like we had back then, which doesn't help. But I think that you mentioned that in 2035 is the ultimate goal to effectively colonize, at least set up a little lunar colony there. And then you mentioned all the different layers that have to be, done, starting with the foundation of solving the logistics and the power problem. I just feel that 9 years is almost an impossible timeline with so many people working on independent parts of this, given my experience to do all of these layers and given all the unknowns. So any thoughts about people's perspective on how realistic that timeline actually is?
Well, I'm skeptical, and I think that realistically speaking, it's good to be skeptical on this. But I am reminded that John F. Kennedy said that we would do something at that time was even probably more impossible. Think about, in those days, you have right on your arm, you have more computational power on that watch on your arm than we had pretty much in the spacecraft, going to the moon, and certainly on the lunar landing module. So Um, the one thing about people who do predictions is they always historically underestimate technologies that we yet don't know much about. So
Hmm.
I'm skeptical. I'm highly skeptical of being able in 9 years to be able to have, some number of people, probably small group, actually living on the moon in an extended period of time. Uh,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's absolutely impossible. I think there's and again, the definition will be important. Living on the moon, is it living on the moon for a week or is it living on the moon for a year? And
That's
so
right. Yeah.
we have to create a whole definition around what living on the moon really means.
Yeah, yeah. You do have another question in the Q&A, if you want to pop that open. I'm going to ask Brian a quick question while you think about that.
Yeah.
Brian, you mentioned that, starting to see, yeah, maybe things like when you speak a word or something, bubbles pop out and things like that, and I was taken back to the idea of some of the things that people, deal with sometimes, or what we call a synesthesia, right? Where you get your senses mixed up, where if you sometimes people who can play music. They will hear a musical note and they will reference that with a specific color. They will see a specific color pop up, or they will hear a certain word and then they will have a specific taste or smell associated with that word. And so there's these interesting things where your senses get kind of mixed up and crossed. And I thought that that could be an interesting area for you to explore maybe in a future talk when it comes to kind of visualization of the world around you and which makes people very, very unique because that is a very small portion of the population that have that as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, synesthesia, I've done some research on it. It is fascinating. Some of our great artists, certainly,
Yeah,
that was the condition. Was it Pharrell Williams or whatever? Anyway, the synesthesia thing, I think if we aren't blessed with that, disability, if you will, um, it is an interesting modality to think and generate ideas.
yeah,
And in our ideation sessions, we might, ask people, well, what colors or what do you see or what do you feel? Um, what do you smell? All those are interesting prompts where you can sort of, pretend you have synesthesia when you don't. But as a mental exercise, it can be very, very powerful, especially if you're dealing, for instance, with health and beauty aids products. How
mm,
do we bring synesthesia into our thinking or synthesis of different modalities
yeah,
into the products we develop?
yeah. No, that's interesting. Yeah, lots of options there. Alan, did you see the question?
I did. Yeah. So the question was about on Earth, the rapid growth of AI is driving massive expansion of data centers and creating major energy demand challenges. And we can have an enormous talk about that. So depending upon who you believe, the right now data centers and AI centers are now consuming 1.5 to 4.5, 5% of the total energy in the United States is produced in the United States. Interestingly enough, when you dig into that, and I've spent a lot of time on this, if you really dig into it, the future problem is not the generation. Like for example, in California, we have actually a surplus and an enormous surplus of solar energy. We don't know what to do with it all. That's why in California, the cheapest rate for energy is during the day, not at night. And so this is where the kilowatt charge is actually less. The problem is going to be it's going to be distribution. It's going to how do you get the power where you need it? And that's going to be the same problem on the moon. That's why the new technology, localized energy, or what we refer to as microgrid technology, will have to be what happens on the moon. And by the way, it's already happening in the US. Almost every major distribution center that Amazon proposes now, they're proposing a micro reactor or they're proposing their own power generation capability, other kinds of generation. Obviously, in the West, they can use batteries with solar. You get into the Pacific Northwest, or you get into the Midwest or East Coast. It's a little bit different than that, but um, what's going to happen with energy, and I'm absolutely 100% certain of this, what we're going to see energy is we're going to see a whole new level of competition for the public utilities, and it's going to be private utilities. It's going to be private distribution, and particularly the distribution will become easier because the power plant, the green energy power plant, will be down the street from you. We already see communities that are being proposed to do this. And indeed, I've taken my entire farm. I mean, I'm sitting in a studio in my farm, and there's absolutely not 1 kilowatt coming from the electric company right now. And all my lights, everything are on. We run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, off of a combination of solar and hydroelectric that we've engineered and built. And so, and that's the sign of resilience. On the moon, take this back to the moon discussion. On the moon, resiliency is going to have to be localized energy, but that localized energy is already in development in particularly in well, in North America is where they're really working heavily on it, but there's other places. Just quick side note. So one of the things I've been looking at is how to rethink how heating and air conditioning work. So I remember the trip to Finland a couple of years ago, and looking at communities that had these huge, which they look like those big, huge oil or water storage tanks you would see in refineries and things like that, but they're really full of sand. And what they're doing is they're storing energy in the sand. Sand turns out to be a great BTU retainer. And then that energy is used to heat things, to turn steam and to create steam, and ultimately to heat houses and stuff. And this is actually fairly common in certain Scandinavia regions. So there are plenty of ways. Just back to Brian's view of innovation, there are plenty of ways to innovate for localized energy production. And the more energy is localized, production is localized, the less distribution becomes a challenge. There's the beauty of it.
Awesome. Thanks, Alan. And that's a wrap on this Father's Day edition of Curious and Quirky. A huge thank you to our speakers for bringing fresh ideas, their bold perspectives, and just enough disruption to remind us that the best innovations often start with someone asking, well, have we tried this yet? And if today sparked your curiosity, many of the topics we explore here today around leadership and innovation and strategy and pricing and organizational change could all be explored at much greater depth through the certificate programs offered by the Caltech Executive Education. Now, as we celebrate Father's Day this month, it's worth remembering that some of life's most important lessons came from dads, mentors, coaches, teachers, and leaders who encouraged us to stay curious, to take chances, and occasionally learn things the hard way, usually after they specifically told us not to do that. So stay curious, stay quirky, and remember, every dad starts a project by saying, this will only take 5 minutes, which is also how most schedule slips begin.